Paradoxes of the Science of Psychology by Meg Tufano. Isn't it strange that modern scientific times have led us to a study of something as seemingly unscientific as the human soul? The word psychology comes from its ancient Greek etymology, the logic of the soul, mind, or spirit. It is hard to imagine how anyone could have devised a logic for something as mysterious as the human soul, isn't it? The scientific method requires systematic observations detached from our feelings, both repeatable and empirical observations that must stick to just the facts. I don't know about you, but that seems almost impossible to me when thinking about human behavior. Most, if not all people, seem to me to be enthralled to some mix of emotions that are hard to unscramble or explain. Students, please note, I'm not a clinical psychologist, but an academic one. I study and teach theories that benefit from an interdisciplinary background like mine because most modern psychologies use ideas taken from all the humanities, especially history, philosophy, and religion. Please also note, I do not give out psychological advice. The upside is that I rarely feel I should judge another person's motives. I am profoundly humbled by the complexity of people. Along with Socrates, the philosopher, I feel as if the only thing I know for sure is that I just do not know what's going on with another person. One of the reasons I pursued a master's in psychology was to discover how something seemingly as ineffable as the human soul became, at least in part, a science. How science got into the story of psychology first demands an understanding of how science began. The scientific method was invented by the proto-astronomer and philosopher Galileo, 1564 to 1642. His method, the scientific method which we learned in grade school, was revolutionary in his times because of the idea that if we did multiple observations of the world with many people as observers, we would get closer to the truth about how the world actually works. We could know things for ourselves, independent of the received wisdom from either the Bible or the great minds such as Aristotle. Amazingly, Galileo's revolutionary idea began with religious faith. He believed that since God created everything, we'd find rational principles if we studied things carefully. Why? Because he believed God is supremely rational. So far, Galileo has been proven correct about rational principles. Almost everything we've scrutinized using objectivity turns out to have utterly rational principles at its core. Significantly, the world has hidden mathematical principles you can learn about in physics, biology, and chemistry. And psychology, we shall see. So how did parts of psychology become scientific? My curiosity as to how psychology became a science has led me to learn a great deal about psychology, including the history of psychology, which is fascinating. Note that observant people throughout history and across cultures have always been interested in why people behave the way they do. The science of psychology was invented by several founders, almost 4 centuries after Galileo, so applying science to the soul took a long time to develop, and then the research exploded. It's impossible to keep up with all the ideas and branches of psychology that have been refined in the last 100 years. The study of this course, devecology, began over 50 years ago in the 1960s with the publications of Bronfenbrenner's 1917 to 2005 ecological systems theory, which, you may be interested to know, became a kind of blueprint for the development of the U.S. Head Start program in 1965. But before we get into the practical applications and the wild ride of ecological systems theory, it would be nice to have context for how this course fits into psychology's history, since understanding context is the main thrust of Bronfenbrenner's insights into psychology. As you probably already know by now, some areas of psychology are much easier to see as scientific than others. For example, some psychologies help people design cockpits for airplanes to ensure that engineers do not use some color of light that most people cannot see, or create a switch that will not work with human hands. That area of psychology is called human factors, a branch of experimental psychology. On the other end of the spectrum is depth psychology, an area involving dreams and associations that seems utterly impossible to design a scientific experiment around, because how does one measure dreams objectively as science requires? And yet, as we shall soon see, inventive thinkers have figured out a few intriguing ways to make even random associations meet the requisite objective measures of time and space of science. As we see in Figure 1, the ideas of depth psychology seem hard to fit into the scientific plane. How, for example, can dreams be measured empirically? Freud, 1856 to 1939, developed a theory of mind that I think was almost impossible to prove. He theorized that our dreams influence our behavior. His proof was based on what people narrated to him. He called the locale where dreams occur the unconscious. This term means unknown. Can you begin to see how parts of psychology that look impossible to study scientifically, if the very thing we're studying is definitionally unknown? B.F. Skinner, 1904 to 1990, the founder of behavioral psychology, got past the problem of dreams and unconsciousness and the unknown by simply ignoring the person altogether. The unknown became a feature, not a bug. He created his theory by objectively measuring what response occurs immediately after an input, especially measuring the response times and keeping what the person thought about and the unknown out of the story. Skinner leaves out what is, to my mind, the most exciting part of psychology, what people are thinking. So I have to admit up front, I hope somebody would figure out a solution to Freud's definitional problem of the unknown when I was on my journey to understand how psychology became a science. That someone was one of Freud's students, Carl G. Jung, 1875 to 1961. A medical doctor in 1902 when he was sent to an asylum of patients who exhibited crazy behavior. He had no way to treat them because no therapy had been invented. There were no psychologists or psychiatrists yet. While there, he came up with a surprisingly scientific and inventive way of analyzing patients. First, he asked them to respond to a list of words, just to say anything, any association that came into their heads, while a nurse measured how long it took for the patient to develop an association. Note time's connection to the scientific plane in Figure 1. The next day, he returned to the same patients and asked them what they were thinking about when they'd been given the word that took the longest for them to come up with an association. Amazingly, that simple experiment led to what we now call analytical psychology or Jungian psychology or sometimes archetypal psychology. Jung began to see consistent correlations between what people were thinking about when they took the longest to respond. He theorized there was something internal in their psyche that they had to get around, which was why it took longer for them to respond. Eventually, he discovered through multiple congruent similar questions and many follow-up interviews that people had to get past internal obstacles to think freely. These barriers were why it took longer to come up with an association. Jung intuited that this was similar to going around a complex of buildings. He began to see that the force surrounding the internal obstacles had a pattern. People were thinking about similar subjects when they took longer to respond to prompts. Their father, mother, girlfriend, child, etc. He eventually called those themes complexes. Jung realized that myths and stories revolved around similar content. He began to speculate there might be universal archetypal themes to human lives that invisibly affected human behavior, the subject of much of depth psychology. The science of Jung's theory comes in because his original experiments were objective and repeatable inside the scientific plane. Jung could fit what appeared to be random associations into the rigor of science. This is a little bit of an aside, but much of the current popularity of MRI studies in psychology is an attempt to keep psychological content inside the scientific plane through measurement in space and time of the brain's neural networks. Ironically, such measures would lead to yet another paradox. To understand that paradox, imagine a computer as analogous to the brain. Could we learn anything of importance or depth by studying how the computer works? Wouldn't we want to look at who made the computer instead? This logical plot twist leads us back to questions in philosophy and religion, a side trip that seems to be repeated often when studying psychology. To conclude this introduction and begin the course, note that Bronfenbrenner's psychological insights build on a wide array of humanities studies, but also, and mainly, a psychology developed by Piaget, 1896 to 1980. Developmental psychology. Coincidentally, Piaget had a similar origin story to Jung's in that Piaget was working in a job in which he too asked questions, not of crazy patients in an asylum, but of children. He was supposed to be translating English intelligence tests, but as he asked his questions, he kept wondering why children gave the wrong answers to what seemed to him simple logic questions. His observations led him to create a new psychology of children's intelligence, how children build up their knowledge about the world. We owe Piaget the insight that specific child ages have particular abilities, an observation Bronfenbrenner takes to new heights. Now let's go and tame the wild ride of how Bronfenbrenner put together the many ideas from psychology and the humanities in systems thinking and devicology. See you in class.